And before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional owners of this land and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. I'm actually going to live on the edge and I'm not going to use my slides because I used them just before lunch and I see quite a few familiar faces from that session. And so I'll do my best to mix it up and make this a little different. I thought what I'd cover is first just a little bit about what IBA has been doing historically and how we're looking to expand our work in housing, particularly some new product development. And then I thought I would look at, given this is about attracting investment, what I think some of the key steps an organisation would have to take to attract investment. And there'll be a lot of overlap with what Kath has talked about.
We can talk about our partnership.
Yes, true. So we'll try and throw those in as well. So for those of you who aren't familiar, IBA is federal government, statutory authority. The purpose is to facilitate self-management and self-sufficiency for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we do that through three broad areas of work: supporting home ownership, entrepreneurship and business development, and investment. Now, historically in home ownership, the goal has been very much to assist families, couples, individuals to build equity. And that program, as I said before lunch, over its life, so over about 50 years, has supported 18,000 families into home ownership, which is about $2 billion of wealth transfer into Indigenous hands. The program is very much designed around a home loan. It's a concessional interest rate. We have low deposit requirements. We have much more flexibility around credit history, and we try and ensure that repayments can be structured so that they're serviceable. 90+% of our clients are first home buyers, and as everyone's hearing, it's very tough to get into the market now if you're a first home buyer everywhere. Over 90% are in what we consider our lower income bands, and that's a shift. So that's 14% more of our customers are in lower income bands than they were a year ago. So we're increasingly moving to support more disadvantaged, more marginalised customers. And over 70% of our customers for home lending are in regional and remote Australia. That's partly because of targeting, but it's also because of the unaffordability of homes in many urban areas. So we've got a product. Last year we did about 545 loans or so, and that equates to about $190 million of lending, and it's been gradually increasing up to that. Last year we did a lot of work to start to build demand and better understand demand. And so the first 3 months of this year, we've done, close to half our full year target in just 3 months. So we think this year we'll do, and I don't want to sort of commit anyone, but it'll be possibly over 750 plus loans, which, is close to the highest, or probably the highest we've ever done. And it's more than $250 million of lending. These are all numbers. I guess why I'm throwing them out there is we're seeing a lot more demand just as it is with the product we have today. We did a demand study through a firm called ACIL, economics type firm, and they're telling us over the next 3 years to 2020, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families they'll be looking for home ownership is actually well over 10,000, possibly over 20,000. So we might be patting ourselves on the back that we do 700 home loans in a year, but we're nowhere near going to satisfy that demand. And a lot of that demand is people that won't be able to go to the banks, particularly with house prices being where they are at the moment. So we need to look at things differently. Is doing things differently is very much the mantra at IBA as well at the moment. Part of that is looking at expanding our product set. So we've reduced interest rates. There's things we can do around that. But we're also looking at shared equity. For those who were there before lunch, we talked about that. So that's where IBA actually can take some of the equity in the house, reduce the amount that the customer then has to borrow. So that might bring an unaffordable house into range for a customer. And they may be able to get part of that loan from a bank, if that works for them. And I'll come back to that. So product development, rent to buy is another thing we're looking at, particularly for outer regional and remote. That's not something IBA's offered historically, but we need to look at different models because one size fits all, as everybody knows, doesn't work. So that's a bit of the shift that's happening in IBA. Diversifying products, partnerships are critical in that. Partnerships with AHO and partnerships with community housing providers. So one thing we've never really had a focus on is seeing home ownership as a pathway. So as everyone's familiar, there's a continuum from homelessness to social housing, affordable rental into home ownership. We've always been at the one end of that spectrum, which is people moving from rental into home ownership. But we'd like to work with community housing providers to structure our involvement so there's a real pathway that we're supporting. And we're doing that thinking at the moment, so it's great to be here. So that's a bit of the context around IBA, and we are particularly interested in looking at how we can finance Aboriginal community housing providers as they're going to start receiving stock potentially through the transfer, and as we're seeing at the federal level, caveats potentially being lifted on the old ATSIC properties. So then I thought, okay, well, what are the steps I think a community organisation would have to go through to attract investment? So I totally agree with Kath. I think absolutely the first step is having a clear long-term investment plan. And that applies to any type of investment, let alone for a community housing provider. About 18 months ago, we worked on a set of principles called the Indigenous Investment Principles. It was launched by the Prime Minister in December 2015. They were drafted actually by representatives of about 40 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations from around the country, and they were drafted over a period of 12 months, and they're publicly available, and I think they're not the be-all and end-all, but I think they provide a really good framework of the steps that a community organisation can go through when considering investing or attracting investment. And they're really about being able to say there's been a structured approach, so that builds confidence that there is clarity about what's being sought, but also confidence from the external partners that you then approach, that process has been followed. So I'd encourage people to have a look at that. They're on the IBA website, and you can Google it and you'll find it. Core to that is, of course, community buy-in and community engagement around those long-term goals. IBA's joint ventured with lots of Aboriginal organisations over a long period of time into investments, and often we've found that organisations have gone into things very quickly without that long-term thinking, and quite often that then unravels. There's a lack of alignment with partners, and that really becomes apparent when you are trying to drive for things like employment outcomes, supply chain outcomes, if those conversations haven't been had up front. So that planning is obviously critical. The second thing I'd say is a really good self-assessment of capacity and readiness, and what are the other skills that your organisation needs to bring onto its board or onto the project if it's not possible at the board level to be ready to get into these sort of projects. Third, I think is critical is not just defining the outcomes as part of the long-term plan, but how you're going to measure those outcomes. There's a lot of tools now that have been developed about how to measure the value of social outcomes. You would have heard about social return on investment. What's the for every dollar invested in the project, what's the social outcome going to be? And there's a lot of information and support available to measure those and define those up front. So then when you're going out to attract investment, you can talk about the investment not just in terms of the financial return, but actually articulate social returns. Now, on all those things, there is actually support available, including from IBA. So outside the homes area, IBA does have business planning and support funding. And we've redefined how that's being delivered as well. Historically, it was come to IBA, we'll pay for a business plan from a consultant, and there was a panel with hundreds of consultants on there that you could pick from. What we're now trying to ensure is that there's actually someone inside IBA that can work with your organisation and then connect you up with the right advice. Now that might be from IBA itself, but also from a much smaller set of, we think, more capable advisors. But that advice is there for going on that investment journey. So to support with investment planning, forecasting, looking at what those outcomes are you're trying to generate. And I think that's all the foundational work that just essentially has to be there, as came out in Kath's speech as well, before you can really successfully get into an attract investment. Then I think comes the question of partners. As I said, IBA itself is looking at partnerships. It's critical to us being successful, just as it will be for a community organisation. I think all those networks that were mentioned are very valuable. I also think partnerships often emerge organically, and one conversation leads to another, and it's about going to other organisations in the sector that have gone through and attracted investment successfully, and finding out where they went to for partnerships and how they approached it. And I think that organic process and referrals from like organisations can never be understated. And then I think the question after that is, where's the investment going to come from? And I thought I'd talk a bit about that. So there is IBA, and we are looking at these new ways of investing, which I think will be a way for community organisations to actually build a bridge to other private investors. But even in that private capital, there's now emerging a lot more groups of investors. So I've been talking a lot to super funds. Now they all talk a good game and they say they want to do things, yet to totally see it, but they've all got people appointed to look at investments with social outcomes. The challenge with them is they want very, very large projects. So for a super fund, $100 million project is what it needs to get out of bed, and that's often a challenge. So to attract that super fund money, and I think we heard before lunch, there's over $2 trillion that Australian super funds are sitting on, and they're investing in social and affordable housing projects overseas and not domestically. I think to attract that, there would have to be something done at a sector level by AHO or many organisations working together. But there are also others. So if you're reading the papers in the last few weeks, impact investment is this topic that keeps getting talked about. Scott Morrison launched an impact investment fund last week that's been launched by Social Ventures Australia. So these are funds, investment funds that have been set up to make a commercial return but also social outcomes. And they're usually looking at smaller projects from anywhere from about $500,000 up to a few $1 million. And they've raised their money mostly from wealthy individuals, foundations, and charities. So they're emerging, and then I think they're looking for projects to put money into, and they often look at property or real estate related projects because there's bricks and mortar there for them to have some security over. The other emerging area is what they're calling venture philanthropy. So it's not a loan, it's not an equity investment, it's what they call patient capital. So it's a zero interest loan that you don't have to pay back for 5 to 7 years. And the main driver is they want their money back eventually, but they want to see those social outcomes. And particularly some of the larger foundations in Australia, like the corporate foundations, are actively looking at that. So there's this spectrum of investment that's starting to emerge, and I think where IBA can play a role is with its investment possibly de-risking projects to try and bring some of this other capital. And I think social and affordable housing is a key area, and it could become a real driver of impact investment generally. The other thing, of course, is government. I mean, everyone wants to rely less on government, and I think that's good. However, what I keep finding is there is all these pockets of government money around, and it just takes navigating to find it. So you've got, obviously the IAS, but outside that you've got, even in the regional development area, a whole different slew of buckets of money for these types of projects, particularly ones that have social and employment outcomes. So one of the things I think we as IBA should do, and I'll take away from, is create a better map of what's actually out there, something open source that can be put on our website or shared about where are all these impact investors, super funds, what do they look for, venture philanthropy, and what is actually out there in government. One of the things we're looking at as well is an app. This is targeted more at small businesses, but we could make it available to community organisations as well. And it's an app to help navigate all of these, particularly government funding and support services. So I guess without taking much more time, in summary, I think there's a very structured process that a community organisation should follow when looking to attract investment. We're very happy to share what knowledge we have and the lessons we've learned, and there's certainly been things that haven't worked out across the country, so we're very happy to share those as well. But also, we're really looking for some pilot projects to test the shared equity and rent-to-buy type idea, and if we can get them working, then I think we can roll them out much more widely. Thanks.
I've actually got one sort of statement in line with Q&A. They'll take it as a comment, not a question, and then I've got a question. So the first one was, so Ashley, our maintenance manager, repairs and maintenance manager, and myself have met with representatives of the IBA, particularly on the business mentoring capability growing element to IBA, which is a new part of its business. And we're actually sitting down with a couple of builders, and IBA is actually providing sort of hands-on mentoring and business partnering. So say as an example, we met with this builder, and the builder was fine, probably business skills, knowing his cost base, particularly estimating, example, winning tenders was a real area of deficiency, and IBA were working with him to sort of offer him some direct practical support. So whilst that may not be particularly relevant to some people in this room, it's a real example of how the IBA is actually providing hands-on support as opposed to big broad programs. These are very specific and successful. That's the comment. The question I had was, the AHO actually does have a home ownership program. It's been on the books for a number of years. We find the barrier mostly is people don't generally understand the value of the property by government, I guess, rules, regulations, treasury guidelines. We have to get a market valuation before we sell the property. My team manages that process, negotiates with your representatives. It's often IBA, the funders. And we offer a small rebate to people to cover their legal fees. But if there was something that, say, the AHO could do to sort of augment that or improve that process, have you got any suggestions, any tips for us to say, okay, what would you like us to do on the home ownership front? And don't say shared equity, because I know you've hammered us on that for 2 days.
I've said that one about 50 times. You mean for an individual that's looking?
Improve the process, yeah.
Look, one of the things I think is important is fast tracking, and so even within IBA, I'm sure there are people have had a great experience with our home loan process. There are also people historically, and we hear it, they've found it slower than they'd like, and we're trying to improve that within the organisation. We have a partnership. The benefit is you can actually come up with some service levels and time frames that we can work through. And for example, if you can help a customer to package up their information, that might make it a lot easier for us to process it on our side. I think Richard Burton's here, and he might want to add to that.
Yeah, I'm Richard Burton. I look after the marketing side of IBA Home, so I've been chucked in the deep end. In beginning of May, I did a fair bit of work with Housing SA, and that was visiting 5 communities: Port Lincoln, Murray Bridge, Port Augusta, and a few others. And what Housing SA did, they wrote to 5,000 tenants and let them know that IBA is going to be there. Come and have a chat. So each information session we had, there was sometimes 70 people there. So far from that, we've approved 12 loans. So these 12 people have actually got out of Housing SA properties, and they've actually bought their own. So that's freed up 4 properties, and there's more coming through. I've met with Housing SA, AHO in Coffs and also Dubbo, to try and get that partnership going, so when events are happening, tenancy events, get IBA to come along. We'll have a chat. Whether people go ahead with it or not, that's not my role. I provide the information, and our information now is very simple. You can download our app on your phone, and it shows what interest rates, deposits, loan calculator, everything there. You can even apply now on your phone the express of interest form. So we're streamlining a whole heap of stuff to make it easier for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to actually have a go at buying a home. Most people don't want to apply because they've done a self-assessment. I can't get a loan because I've got bad credit. I can't get a loan because I've got debt. I can't get a loan because I haven't got 10% deposit. What we're trying to do is just break down or demystify getting into home ownership. So if AHO, and I've already spoken to your counterparts, if AHO knows something's happening, give us a buzz. Thanks.